decided to engage ourselves in that highly imprecise field called applied arts. Applied arts for us means how new technologies can challenge us in finding new forms.
The World of Fragile Parts is basically about the power of the copy in perpetuating and preserving material culture. All of our material culture, even the seemingly solid, is fragile, thus a world of fragile parts, and that in order to think about long-term preservation and long-term perpetuation of culture, essentially what we're always doing is reproducing things.
I never knew why I should even care about the replicas of the world, but then witnessing and looking at the news, the amount of destruction of old heritage places, I would be very curious to look again at the new tools that are available to be able to create such an archive of knowledge for the posterity of mankind.
The V&A is a unique museum because we have a variety of collections, a variety that shows the world how it functioned 150 years ago. It's made for practitioners, at that time for designers, engineers, architects, and 150 years later it's still the same. And that's the reason why I think we are the right institution to talk about 3D printing and replica today.
The history of copying is a long one. We take as our starting point the 19th century because that's where the V&A comes into the story. But there is a longer history to it than that. You can go back to ancient Rome. Most of the marble statues, which we now see as the great works of the classical era, are in fact Roman marble copies of lost Greek bronzes. Copying is not new.
So there's this 19th century tradition where the V&A engaged in a lot of productions of plaster casts, trying to collect great works of art and architecture from around Europe to bring to a British public. So if you go to the V&A today, you can walk to 2 cast courts and you can see these kinds of monumental pieces of architecture, which are in fact copies. And what struck me as very interesting with those is that in fact they are copies. And when people walk into those rooms, they don't immediately recognize them as such. And by virtue of the fact that they've been at the V&A for so long, they've kind of taken on a new value. These cast courts are real kind of evident proof that a copy can exist in its own right and have its own story. So we wanted to divide the show into 2 parts, roughly. One that looks at this 19th century tradition that the V&A was a part of in the production of copies, and one that's looking at new technologies and new practitioners engaged in the production of copies. So when you first walk into the space, you're confronted with an arch. We've reconstructed an arch. And we wanted to have something quite monumental in the show that reflected the kind of monumental character of the cast courts.
It's a one-to-one scale replica of the Porta Magna at the Basilica of San Petronio in Bologna. So it's 3 meters high, 6 meters wide, and it's an arch composed of plaster panels. These are 19th century plaster replicas of the original marble panels on the facade of the basilica. And then the first thing you see immediately beyond the arch is something that at first you might not recognize it. This huge, gargantuan, white monolith. What is it? It's a piece called Dar Abu Said. It's another one-to-one scale replica of a refugee shelter from the jungle camp at Calais. And this was designed, conceived by Sam Jacobs Studio. The original was something valueless, ephemeral, made from plastic and plywood. And by transforming this, by copying it and turning it into stone, you elevate this humble structure to the status of a sculptural monument.
In the main room of the exhibition, we've divided it into two sections, one that's looking at V&A objects and one that's looking at contemporary objects. In the V&A section, we look at, firstly, a kind of triumvirate of copying that was taking place in the 19th century. And this was using, at the time, the most up-to-date technology available. That was advances in plaster casting technology, photography, which was very new at the time, and a process called electrotyping, which doesn't exist so much anymore, but was used to make metal copies of virtually anything. Then we look at a few objects that actually have attained new value over the course of 150 years because of their longevity. So we have objects that have been destroyed for various reasons. So we have a bust which has been in the museum for 150 years, but its original was destroyed in World War II in Berlin. So it becomes the only remaining kind of record of that object. We also have life cast impressions of hands by Joseph Edgar Boom. So these are kind of one-to-one impressions of popular figures in the 19th century, really a snapshot in time of themselves, essentially.
The second key section of the show is contemporary. We've collaborated with artists, activists, conservators, and other projects to showcase different works which are, if you like, a meditation on the copy. And some of these are what you might call quite straightforward copies, the idea being to reconstruct as far as possible the most perfect representation of an original. Others are more, shall we say, postmodern. The idea being that they take the copy as a kind of starting point and then an intervention is made from that.
So one of the first projects we've shown in the contemporary section of the exhibition is called The Other Nefertiti. It's a project done by two Berlin-based artists who were very interested in the Nefertiti bust, which is an object held by the Neues Museum and is rather controversial because it's an object that's been taken from Egypt and there's large restitution claims about it. What upset the artists most about the object, though, was that the museum had a digital scan of it and they weren't releasing it to a public. They were able to go into the museum and surreptitiously scan it using simply Xbox Connect attached around the neck, and then they released it online. Their idea behind that was to make it publicly available so that it could be used in as many ways as possible, and in a way restoring the object to now a kind of global domain. We have a lot of organizations that have been working in the Middle East using new technologies to kind of reconstitute objects that have been lost during the ISIS attacks of last year. We have artists looking at kind of the state of the digital world and the digital world as a possible ruin. So this is a piece by Andreas Angelidakis. It's actually two pieces, one called Soft Ruin, which is these large pieces you see in front of you, and a video that he's done called How to Build an Electric Ruin. What's interesting about Andreas's work is he's very much interested in digital spaces and the possibility for digital spaces to also become ruins. A lot of the work we see here is presupposed on the idea that we can store everything in a digital space and that will keep it secure forever. But as anybody who's worked in digital environments before knows, that digital environments are prone to decay. So what Andreas likes to do is he likes to design things in the digital world, but then constitute them in the real as a kind of backup to those digital files. On the one hand, this exhibition is really important today to be talking about, in that I think we're becoming more and more aware of the fragility of the material world around us. Last year, there was quite a lot of news about the destruction of material culture from Syria and from Iraq because of ISIS. But increasingly, we're becoming more aware of the soft violence against our material culture that's acted upon by things like climate change, environmental disaster, but also things like mass tourism. So we need to start talking about how we can record our material culture and preserve it for the long term.
Even those of us who work in museums can take culture a little for granted, and perhaps the more attuned we are to the risks that our global heritage faces, the more we will work to protect them in the first place, but also to gather as much copy data and as many records as possible to mitigate against the future risk of destruction or damage. So I hope people have their awareness of this global issue raised as they walk around the show and think about what we've presented.